Your assignment to Vietnam in 1954 was largely based on your success in helping the Philippine government to fight its pro-communist guerrillas. First, how did you get the assignment to Vietnam, and do you think the Philippine experience was relevant to Vietnam?
The difference between my experience in the Philippines and the experience in Vietnam had many similarities and some very sharp differences that were important. I had visited Vietnam as part of a mission to check on the needs of the French forces fighting there in 1953. And later that year, I was in a meeting in the Pentagon that was called by President Eisenhower and was chaired by the Secretary of Defense, but had John Foster Dulles in it. And as they were talking about the results of our visit earlier in the year, John Foster Dulles, in replying to some question that was asked there, turned around and looked at me and said, well, we're going to send Ed over to Indochina, and don't you want to go? I said, well, I really don't, but if I could work with the Vietnamese rather than with the French, why, I'd be willing to go over and try and help out, but what is it you want me to do? He said, I'd like you to do the same thing you did in the Philippines. So that was the similarity. The differences were quite marked. In the Philippines, we were working with a government that had elected officials against an enemy that was trying to overthrow them and set up a new political system. In Vietnam, the officials in South Vietnam were either foreign, meaning French, or were appointed Vietnamese. So that the association and image that they gave to the people was not of being their own officials, but of being appointed and of strangers, foreigners. This was in a country that had a very deep suspicion of foreigners, even those who had been around among them for so long as the French had been. And as the Geneva Convention met and was deciding on the terms of the peace in Vietnam, the French made political sounds that they were going to move out. But what that meant was that they would move out almost an entire government leadership structure, not only in Saigon, but out in the provinces. So in the Philippines, I had helped the Philippine government and govern well and help the armed forces bring back essentially enough peace to have the government operate in favor of the people. And in Vietnam, the whole government structure was leaving the country, and the people out in the countryside had heard of Saigon. Some of them had visited there, but to them it didn't represent a government, and the structure had a great vacuum in it, so that the problems became very sharply different. The enemy, strangely enough, had remained very much the same type of an enemy, had grown much bigger in fighting against the French forces, but had started life as about the same number, the same size as the Communist Party and its armed forces in the Philippines, but had grown, about 3-4 times as large by the time it gotten there, and kept growing all the time. And had successes which the Philippine communists had never had the successes that the Vietnamese ones had. Among the other contrasts on that are the problems that I had to deal with almost immediately in Vietnam was to help the Vietnamese take over and govern themselves. And they needed some encouragement and some guidance on that, so that as struggles would take place out in the provinces, there needed to be something other than a foreign element, meaning people from a big city, the capital city of Saigon, coming out to the countryside to work with the farmers and rice paddy people out in the provinces. In the Philippines, the problems had devolved into essentially military and political types. The military to protect the people, and the political to really represent the people, to let the people feel that it was their own choice of people that were governing them. I went to the Philippines the second time to help in the Hook Rebellion in 1950, and at that time, the Hook guerrillas, the communist guerrillas, had achieved considerable success in dominating the provinces around Manila. But they had done so by claiming to the people that the elected government had not won fairly in elections. So that one of the big things that took place in the Philippines was advising the army to get in on the electoral process and helping the Commission on Elections there maintain the law according to what was on the books, so that they became, in effect, not poll watchers, but guardians of the sanctity of secret balloting. And the big turning points in the campaign against the communists there came about during two elections. The first one was a by-election in 1951, when governors and mayors of cities were elected, and the armed forces made sure that there wasn't fraud in around the polling places, and people who were running and who actually won the votes and were most popular were elected. And this, the people could clearly see that the government was theirs and was representing them, and had no use for people who were asking them not to vote and saying that their votes wouldn't be counted and that the government should be overthrown. In effect, the people said, well, we voted, our votes were counted, these are our people and it's our government, and we aren't going to help you overthrow it. There was no such feeling at all in Vietnam. The people said, who's that in Saigon? They're French, they're foreigners, we want them out of the country. And they didn't want to side with the communists by the time I got there. They had seen the communist organization, and most of them preferred to sit on the fence. And I think the great majority of people just wish that everybody would go away and leave them alone.
Looking back, do you think it was a mistake for the United States to have supported the French as far back, starting as far back as 1950?
A mistake supporting the French, 1950. Really not. I think that there were factors in our consideration of helping the French that went far beyond Vietnam and what the French were trying to do there. Don't forget they'd been our ally in World War II. We had very close cultural and economic ties with France. We were helping them bring some order and stabilization in a place that they said that they were going to get out of and leave there and make independent, which is what they told us, and I think that their eventual intent was to do that. There was a great deal of misgiving in Washington, as far as I could gather, about doing more than giving them some supplies and material things and not getting any further involved for ourselves.
Were you involved at all or in Washington at the time, the Eisenhower administration, when the decision had to be made over whether to help the French at Dien Bien Phu? You remember that?
Yeah, I was in the Philippines at the time and not out of any first-hand knowledge at all about the decision on Dien Bien Phu and helping.
Could I ask your opinion? Do you think we should have helped the French at Dien Bien Phu?
Help the French at Dien Bien Phu. I think we were correct in our decision to stay out. I think we would have gotten involved and pulled in sort of backwards and had very little say about how things should be done. And we would have been caught in some combat action that we could neither control our own forces or those of other forces involved. And I don't think we could have saved the French at that time.
Now, you went to Saigon at the head of the Saigon military mission. Was this early 1954?
I went there in, let's see, I think it was May, towards the summer of '54. I was in Manila at the time. President Magsaysay of the Philippines had asked me to come in and help him on some of his work with his Congress there, many of whom were close friends of mine in the Philippines. And this was on his broad programs of work that he was trying to do inside the country, of social changes he was trying to bring about. And I got orders in while I was there to proceed immediately to Saigon. And I was appointed temporarily as an assistant attaché of the Air Force. And it wasn't until I got there and talked with General O'Daniel, who was head of our military mission in Saigon at the time, who asked me to also come out and help him with his MAG problems of training, and or not training at the time, of checking on military support to the Vietnamese.
What was Saigon like in those days, in the spring of '54?
It was wartime yet when I was there. There are lots of evidence on the streets of military traffic. The French had a great love for messengers on motorcycles, so you would notice in the heavily clogged traffic of bicycles and small French cars and taxis and cyclos, which are the motorized rickshaws of Vietnam. Suddenly these motorcycles of a French soldier hunkered down over the handlebars and wearing a helmet and going as fast as he could, weaving in and out of traffic, delivering some sort of a message from one headquarters to another. Many more trees than later in the American times of the war, and with lots of foliage out, somehow or other seeming more peaceful than it became later on, and a less hurried atmosphere as far as the Vietnamese were concerned. Many of the residents of Saigon in those days felt themselves to be fence sitters. They wanted no part of either side in the war, and went about their usual business, so that the sidewalks were crowded with people socializing and talking around the public pumps, and in the marketplaces there was much more leisure. Outside of seeing the military on the streets, it was a peaceful scene. The war was very remote to them.
It's been said that Saigon in those days was maybe one of the most corrupt cities in the world.
That and peace go along hand in hand, unfortunately, and many things. Saigon was corrupt. but corrupt in the sense that you'd see in any civilization, and that there were ways to beat the rules of the game of government. And in Saigon, in those days, the corruption was the worldwide one of gangsterism, of prostitution, of gambling, of normal illegal acts, the legality of any government. Later on, the corruption changed and became something quite else that ate away at the Vietnamese armed forces, and was more in the terms of graft than Saigon of those days. There was, in the earlier Saigon, there was usually in the downtown streets or around some of the side streets, you could get a heady whiff of opium on the air. That there were opium smoking circles that many of the Vietnamese and many of the French who were in the town would go over and have a pipe of an afternoon and thought nothing of it.
What was the Saigon military mission? That was an organization that you set up, wasn't it?
That was one that I set up.
I'm sorry, could you start by saying I set up the Saigon military mission?
I set up the Saigon military mission to have a mom and papa for a group of very unconventional military people that I'd brought together, who manned the direct aid section of our military advisory group to work directly with Vietnamese on a wide variety of subjects, including the psychological operations of the Vietnamese Army, and maintained help up in Hanoi to the refugee program while it was going on, and also performed some advisory duties into the civil government of Vietnam. And these were all military people, but their duties were a little bit apart from the ordinary military duties to fit a very peculiar need at the time. When the need was largely resolved, the mission was disbanded.
Was that group responsible to under the American military or under the CIA?
It was really responsible back to several people in Washington, including the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, the CIA, and to the Chief of Staff of the various services. Essentially, the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Well, with you and the other members of the group, were you getting paid by the CIA or by the State Department, or who was paying you?
Some of them were paid by CIA. I was paid by the Air Force. I was a regular Air Force officer. A number of the others were regular officers and were paid by their services, their military services while they were there. Some were in the State Department and were paid by the state as Foreign Service officers. The main difficulty with this type of a thing is that we were against an enemy in a struggle, an enemy that was halfway acknowledged by the United States, the communist forces, who had an organization for which we had no counterpart on our side. They had a cadre, a political cadre, a military cadre, who were often the same person, doing things that were way beyond the very formal type of organization that the United States had for such a struggle. And something was needed on our side that could counterpart them to make sure that everything that we did, or as much as possible of what we did, would be effective. Because some of their military leaders were more political leaders than they were military, or if not, if they were as good a military leader, such as General Giap, they had a very good political sense and would do things for political effect. And as most of Giap's battles were for the political, psychological effect of what he did. And we had none of our people, the ambassador at the time, the generals that we had out there, the economic chiefs, were people who saw themselves, other than the roles assigned them in Washington, not as ambassador general or general ambassador or anything like that, but as playing a very straight role as Americans do.
But in this description, your group was a group of Americans trying to get into this military come political role, whereas on the communist side they were Vietnamese, so they had a kind of nationalistic credential. I mean,
Which we didn't.
We should go back and repeat the subject there. You know.
Our group were different from the communist side, in that the communists were Vietnamese and we were Americans, and we were acting as advisors to Vietnamese. And the important essential point in that is we were asking the Vietnamese to do things that were best for their country, and almost entirely we're asking them to do things their style rather than ours, based on their culture, their feelings of morality and principles that they believed in, but to do it for their country. And primarily, other than technical advice, which we gave at times, we were urging them to see the problem whole that they were looking at, because many of the Vietnamese that we were dealing with had no experience or very little experience in, for example, public administration. The military officers were by and large city boys who had to operate in the countryside, and hadn't known farming, hadn't known the mores and background of rice paddy farmers and little villagers and so on, so that we stepped out of the role of having them do things American ways for American reasons or for our own country, but we're urging them to do things for their country, Vietnamese style, and in their way.
But you describe our Vietnamese as being largely city, urban types. In many ways, weren't they just as foreign in the countryside of Vietnam as we were?
The officials and officers in particular, the Vietnamese government and armed forces, were city boys mainly because they needed at least a high school education to hold a job or to be an officer. The high schools were very far and few between in an ex-colony. I forget how many high schools, but there were very, very few of them. In order to get an education, you would have to go to a city and go to a high school. There was one university in Vietnam, the University of Hanoi. Again, it only had city people because it took money to go to school. It took a residence in a city while you were going to school. And even if you had come from the countryside as a young person, you would have to move into the city and grow up essentially in a city, picking up city ways and city outlook on life. So that when they would get out in the countryside, this was mostly new to them. And the people of Vietnam out in the countryside are xenophobic, and particularly so in the places where most of the combat took place in Vietnam, and where even people from the next village sometimes were looked on as foreigners. So when people came in who dressed differently, who had different faces, different skin coloration, they were definitely foreign. And it took people from that own vicinity to be accepted by them. That changed gradually as later as Americans fought out in the countryside, as they became familiar figures to the Vietnamese. But there's a little bit of that still inside them. The Vietnamese villagers of a little bit of hesitancy with any stranger.
You were a special advisor to Ngo Dinh Diem in those days. What was he like, and how would you describe his understanding of the situation in Vietnam?
I got to know Ngo Dinh Diem shortly after he came to Vietnam, returned to it in 1954 as a appointed prime minister of Emperor Bao Dai. And I became very close to him in a sort of an accidental way, and was never his official advisor. We became very close friends, and I did give him advice on many subjects with considerable guidance and discussion beforehand with U.S. officials, I might add. But I had never heard of Diem before I went to Vietnam, and he wasn't there when I was serving there in the earlier parts of '54. But word came that this man was coming in as prime minister, and I recall our ambassador at the time asking me what I knew about him. I told him I'd never heard of him, and he said he knew practically nothing about him. He just had a few brief notes on his biography, and I went out to find out about him from Vietnamese I knew. A number of them knew a great deal about him, and they either liked him fully and no holds barred, 100% for him, or 100% against him. He was a man of controversy. Those who were for him said that he was a very honest person, very acceptable to them as being a person of intensely high morality. Those who didn't like him said he's stupid. So they wouldn't fault him for anything other than they felt that he didn't know enough to be the boss. They felt that he wouldn't be corrupt, that he wouldn't condone graft, that he was a stickler morally. But they all knew him, and there wasn't a person that I talked to that didn't know a great deal about him. And they also told me that he had been an administrator in the provinces before and had made a name for himself by very strict but very thorough administration of problems for the Vietnamese who were then had a courted way. He was due in at the airport, Tan Son Nhut Airport, one day, and I was invited as part of the diplomatic group to go out and receive him. As I started out towards the airport, the streets were just lined with mobs of people, and I got a sudden impulse to pull off to the side and watch his arrival from the streets among the people rather than out the diplomatic crowd out at the airport. So I pulled in and I parked my car and got out and stood with the mobs on the sidewalks. And we waited and waited and waited for something to happen, and nothing did. And his flight apparently had been delayed, and the diplomatic reception out at the airport took a long time. But all of a sudden, down the street, we could hear a noise of motorcycles coming, and everybody said, "He's coming." So they were hoisting kids up on their shoulders, and everybody crowding out to see him, and I along with them. And suddenly, past us at about 60 miles an hour, came a motorcycle escort and a closed car. You couldn't see anybody in it. And it went by, and everybody started asking, "Was that him? You know, did he come in?" and so on. And tremendous disappointment at not seeing him. Here was a tremendously enthusiastic, friendly crowd of people who didn't get to see the show that they wanted to, or to cheer the man. I felt that this had been a terrible mistake on somebody's part of letting a man come in at a very dark hour in his country's history, and doing it sort of secretively and very security-minded, as though he didn't want to get close to the people at all and stay away. So I went down afterwards to our embassy and talked with the ambassador, and also talked with the chief of MAG, General Daniel, and told them that I felt he'd made a tremendous mistake, and if somebody was advising him about the people the way to make that sort of a mistake, he must be making mistakes on other things. And I had been traveling all over the country talking with all sorts of Vietnamese, and I knew what they wanted to see this man do, and if our American officials wouldn't mind, I'd like to write down some very short notes and outline for this man and go up and give them to him. They told me that they wanted to see what I was going to say first, so I went to work and stayed up all night writing a very short paper, 4 or 5 pages of notions on economics, on administration out in the countryside, of agricultural needs, and some reforms that would be made, and all of the things that the Vietnamese had been telling me of what they want this man to do. So I showed it to our officials, who told me to go ahead. I couldn't do it as an official U.S. document, but if I wanted to present it on my own and make sure that they knew it was on my own, go ahead with it. I didn't speak French, so I got the head of USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, George Hellier, to come along with me and act as an interpreter for me. So we went over to the government palace where the Prime Minister was, and the building was almost deserted. There were a few people wandering around in the halls, but I couldn't see anything that said the Prime Minister's office or any guards on the door to ask questions of. But one person hurrying along, I stopped and asked for the Prime Minister, and he said, "He's upstairs." So we climbed up the stairs, and there was nobody in the hall up there, but there was a door ajar, and I stuck my head in, and there was a small-statured, roly-poly person sitting there, and the first thing I noticed was that his feet weren't touching the floor when he was sitting, and so he pulled up at a table. And I asked him where the Prime Minister's office was, and he said that he was the Prime Minister. So this is the way I met Diem. Then I told him about being with the crowds, watching his arrival, and I felt that some advisor of his was making a terrible mistake of keeping him away from the people, and that I had had the good fortune of being able to travel around the country and talk to a lot of Vietnamese, and I'd put together some notes on my own that more or less said and outlined what the people expected of him and would he mind if I gave them to him. And I explained I was doing this strictly on my own as an American who had done this unofficially. So he took the paper, and then he was reading, and I said, well, I brought my friend here with me, George Hellier, who can read it to you in French and translate it. So George reached over and took this document, and he held it like this to read it, and then he held it way on out, and George said, I forgot my glasses, see, and I can't see the typing on this thing. So Jim took off his glasses and put them on George, and George then read it. And this was the start of a relationship that brought me in to see a part of him that I've never heard from anybody else, of a friendship that showed a character who was extremely different from journalist views of or diplomatic views of the man. I saw a family man, because I was invited to dine at times with a family, and which he wasn't the oldest brother, and he wasn't the boss of a country or anything. He was just one of the members of the family who you'd reach over if you wanted to grab a piece of food across his plate and so on. A man with a delightful sense of humor. Here he had been pictured all along as a remote Mandarin type, and he had a delightful wit. His humor was so dry that you'd have to look at him sometimes to catch whether he was pulling your leg or being sort of stupid about something, and I'd catch that little glint in his eye. And which reminds me, the man had a tremendous look of intelligence and spark of life in his eyes. The most important part of his features. There was always a sparkle, a little gleam there, and he'd catch the humor and so forth when he'd find something very funny and was holding himself in and sort of laughing inside at something. To an otherwise sort of roly-poly type of a person, this distinguished him from others of the same stature and in the any walk of life.
Excuse me. To what extent did he take your advice, and to what extent do you think that he, if you can give us some anecdotes of advice that you gave him that he took, and maybe if we can project a little bit to the future, were there any flaws in him that eventually contributed to his downfall?
The advice that I gave him was usually on a current problem that beset him, and I would ask him to describe the problem to me and get him talking about not only the problem but how a Vietnamese who loved his country and was trying to serve the people should ideally resolve the problem. This type of a discussion would usually let him get his ideas sorted out and in some order, and in some order of priority, so that he would feel that something must be done, and would undertake something that was Vietnamese and his own, so that the taking of advice wasn't so much as taking my advice, but was taking his own advice as re-described by me and sorted out and put in some shape. Frequently, he would ask me how things would look to other countries, and I would answer that as best as I could. And we would get into considerable discussions of social philosophies and so forth, and including the Vietnamese approach to problems, so that he would take the advice because it was his own. I don't think he ever really dissembled to me on that. it wasn't that type of a relationship. There was no need for him to be dishonest at all in any way, nor on my part. We had extremely frank discussions on things.
Could you remember some examples?
One of the problems that he had personally was he was steeped in a Vietnamese Mandarin tradition, and I recall one time he was also an amateur photographer. He ran his own darkroom in the palace, but he was showing me some pictures taken of a visit to the provinces, which is something I was always urging him to do, to get out and talk to people. And as he did this, I said, well, shame on you. You've got these farmers out in the fields taking off their hats, and you're talking down to them. And because they must be bowing or something, they're afraid to look. And you can't get the truth from a man whose eyes you can't see, and who you aren't looking in his face and having a really man-to-man conversation. So tell them to keep their hats on, tell them who you are, and talk to them. When you start showing me pictures of you doing that, I'll think that you start learning what your own people want, and they won't tell you anything just to have you go away and feel happy, but you'll be getting the truth from them. He started doing that, and he would do dangerous things for his personal security. The first time we got him down to the Mekong area, where we were trying to get the government reestablished in areas that the enemy had left under the Geneva Accords. And it left a big gap in administration and so forth. It's a region of swamps and rivers and streams and so on. And Jim got in a boat and started rowing down a stream, and there were tall grasses all along the banks, and of course there were enemy guerrillas nearby, and he said, no, I haven't done this for a long time, you know. He enjoyed it, and he rode over to some farmers and talked to them and asked what things were happening there. But the main thing about him was that he was getting over some habits that